Hello and
Hello.
welcome to our
Welcome to Coyotenomics.
our next episode, which is going to be about primarily charter schools and their relationship with public unions, and also public police unions to a lesser extent.
Yeah, as a follow-up to private unions last week.
Yeah,
I'm sure you all watched.
absolutely. And yeah, Tyson, is there anything that you've been reading this week that you wanted to share with the audience? Or
I didn't really read much this week, but I went to the Calgary Art Walk, which I thought was pretty neat. It's a festival they put on every year where all the galleries in Calgary open up for free access and show off art. And often a lot of them have local artists there to talk to you, or like you can see what they're painting. And I bought this painting over here. So that was pretty neat.
which is a reflection of water and leaves.
Yeah,
I've decided. It's not abstract. I have decided this is so.
Oh yeah. It's a
Cool.
reflection of yourself, Luke.
Okay. I started a new audiobook called False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg. He's been involved in climate policy for about 20 years, and he's on the panel of the Copenhagen think tank, which is involved in trying to look towards the next green energy replacements and trying to promote investment in green energy alternatives. And one thing I learned from this book recently is that apparently in the last 35 years, we've had a massive increase in greenery on the planet, like trees and plants.
Yeah.
And apparently the size of Australia times 2 has been added to our planet in the last 35 years. So that's pretty cool, you know? And the main gist of the book is that, well, global warming is a serious issue. It's not quite the emergency scenario that has been portrayed as, and also that a lot of the solutions that are currently being presented are not necessarily very good solutions. And he presents what he thinks are better solutions.
Interesting.
But,
That does
yeah,
sound fascinating.
I would love to do an episode on this book. So
Yeah.
coming at you soon.
You want to say the title again?
Yes, it's called False Alarm, and it's by Bjorn Lomborg. Its name is Bjorn Lomborg.
We'll throw a link in the description.
Yeah, I'll definitely throw in just an image of the thing right here.
Sweet.
Cool. And now onto the meat and potatoes of our video.
Yeah. So why don't you lead off and tell us what you read about? And
Yeah, well, the main gist of this video is going to be based on a book called Charter Schools and Their Enemies by Thomas Sowell. And it's basically an exploration into the success of charter schools and their difficulty in spreading despite their success. So to start off, I'll kind of talk about what charter schools are. And these are public charter schools. So these started emerging in the 90s on any sort of a widespread way. And their purpose was to allow public schools to have more of an independent say in how they were run. And so they were publicly funded, but the thought was public schools are doing very poorly. They're not producing very good standards of education. So maybe we should afford more leniency and more liberty to people putting in place these institutions to try to come up with something new, anything new. And so they're much more independently run, but if they do achieve a certain educational success, they get public funding. But the difference is that children they apply to go to them, actually. Public schools, you just kind of are sent to a certain school in your area, but for a public charter school, you enter a lottery system is generally how it's done. And a certain amount of students are drawn from the lottery and win every year, and they go to the public charter schools. And there's like over 1 million kids on these waiting lists for public charter schools in the US, so they're very popular.
so this is primarily a U.S. phenomenon?
I'm not sure. This book is actually studying it primarily in the US.
Okay.
So this is just kind of a look at some of the perverse incentives that can emerge from public unions, but I'm sure it applies to some extent in other places as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, the public charter schools primarily are geared towards low-income areas, and the majority of students are Black and Latino kids. And so a lot of them are in like poor areas in like New York and Harlem and other areas like that. And there are certain charter schools, not all of them, but certain public charter schools like the Success Academy and the KIP Academy, for instance, have done very well. And they have actually produced students that score above the state average. Like in New York, for instance, students at the Success Academy. And these are like minority students that they traditionally have scored much lower than, not much lower, but they've traditionally scored lower than whites and Asians on standardized testing. And this is seen as a product of like deep institutional racism that is very difficult to tackle. But actually, Success Academy has produced results where Black students are performing above the state average. So it's a huge, amazing accomplishment. And you would hope that it would be more, praised and worthy of, the success would be praised. And because the purpose of charter schools was to explore alternatives, and if they work out, let's take this standard and adopt it in a more widespread way to other public schools, you'd hope that that would happen as well. But what has actually happened, in especially the last 2 years, in 2018 and 2019, a lot of governors and mayors have platformed or have adopted a very anti-charter school platform. Like the mayor of New York is very anti-charter schools, and he did a famous speech about a year ago where he railed against charter schools as being this threat to the public institutions and how they're trying to take the business away and whatever. Mm-hmm. And also in California, there's been a lot of regulations passed that essentially remove the autonomy of charter schools, which is what made them so useful in the first place as a means of exploring options. Now they're less autonomous. And it's been a really interesting regressive trend away from supporting these institutions in the last few years, which is remarkable given their success. And there's even been instances where, because apparently charter schools often have a great difficulty finding places to house students. So they'll acquire funding, they'll acquire everything they need, but they just need to buy a new school. And because public schools are less and less popular in the States and charter schools are more and more popular, they're finding that many public schools are closing down. But when such a thing happens, oftentimes they will stipulate in their contract that the public school, which is being closed down, cannot be sold to a charter school, or may only be sold for residential purposes, or may only be sold for a for-profit school institution. So a private school, but not a public charter school. And they've been directly asked why this is the case. And one school principal actually said, well, this is like asking Coca-Cola to sell their facilities to Pepsi. So they actually view the public charter schools as competition, which is so perverse because obviously that's not their institution, it's taxpayer funded, and they're not the competition. Fundamentally, they should care about the education of students, and clearly they don't. And as one public teachers union representative said, when students start paying union dues, he'll start representing students, but until then, he's representing teachers. And so there's this fascinating, fundamental. Maybe I didn't cover this actually. I should go back. The reason public teachers are so against public charter schools is because public charter schools don't give union dues. The teachers are very rarely involved in unions, and so they don't actually give union dues to the public unions, or the public teacher unions. And so teachers unions are, they lose a lot of funding if charter schools get more popular, and they see this as a big threat.
And is this generally an environment where private schools would be unionized or would not be unionized?
Pardon?
Is this an environment where private schools are also non-unionized, or?
I'm not sure about private schools. This book was mainly talking about public charter schools.
Okay.
And contrasting.
Public, like regular school versus public charter school.
So they're all government funded. They're all free to go to, and you just whether or not you win the lottery essentially to go to them.
Yeah.
And it's just a fascinating situation where I think there's a big tendency to assume that public institutions are not for profit. And I think fundamentally because all these institutions are full of people, and people are generally speaking self-motivated. Of course, these public institutions are also going to be for profit as well. And this is an interesting example of how that's the case, where they're trying to defend their little piece of power, their little piece of pie. Yeah. And essentially at the expense of students, and especially at the expense of lower income students and these like underprivileged minorities who are most vulnerable. The idea that they are being like their success is being ignored, and honestly it's pretty wild, the fact that they have been so maligned.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of interesting things about how difficult it is to fire a public school teacher in the States. Apparently, it takes on average over 2 years and upwards of over $300,000 to fire a public school teacher. And for this reason, oftentimes they don't even try to do that. They'll just put them in these kind of called padded rooms, colloquially, and let them drink coffee all day and wait out the clock, because that way they won't be, inflicting their insane teaching practices on actual students.
Have you ever watched a show called The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt?
I saw a little bit of that. Yeah, it's a great show.
Yeah. So there's an episode where she's in like a GED class, and the teacher there is like one step away from being put in the padded room and not being allowed to teach anymore. So he's trying to like up the class as bad as he can.
That's so funny.
He's been working like it's the reversal of the usual career narrative. Like his whole career, he's been working to reach the bottom and finally not be able to teach anymore.
I think I remember that. I think they referenced that, but at that point I didn't know that was a real thing. But yeah, apparently that's a real thing, which is
it was Richard Kind as the teacher. Is pretty funny.
Okay. And yeah, there's like one story of a teacher who was caught like passed out with alcohol on her breath in a class full of students, and she still wasn't fired. And just amazing things. One example where teachers were accused of sexually assaulting students, and the union still demanded they got their jobs back. In that case, the state refused and they didn't give the teachers their jobs back, and they expected maybe the union might sue, but they didn't. But it's just wild that the unions actually asked for that. And yeah, it just seems like to be a situation where public power is used in a way to defend profit at the expense of parents and their children, essentially.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, and that's like, I guess, most of the information in that book. And I was trying to think about how there are parallels between those public unions and other public unions, and what are the central ways in which, or what's the common theme? Like what's common amongst them that makes them so corrupt and inefficient? And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on?
So actually, this was one of my points that I wanted to go on, which is that like often we have two phenomenon that are coinciding in a lot of these cases. One of which is like the fact that it's publicly funded, like sort of the incentive structure is different and how things are held to account is different. And the other thing that almost always comes along with it is that it is also a monopoly. Like when you have police are a monopoly. Hospitals, in a lot of places at least, are a monopoly. Schools, like your school system, often a monopoly in some regard. And I was curious as to whether you thought that these are more issues with the public funding model or more monopoly issues, and where you see like the crucial differences. And if there are perhaps examples that would draw those lines more clearly.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to separate the two, because oftentimes when something is a monopoly, it's going to be publicly funded, assuming we're talking about government monopoly.
Yeah. And
it's very difficult to have something publicly funded if it's not a monopoly. At least if it is, it's a strange circumstance. It's essentially like a market, but you're going to be subsidizing one option out of many. I would guess my instinct is to say that the biggest issue is the coercive element. If people are forced to deal with only the public teachers union and this one monopoly, then that power, where people are no longer allowed to just disassociate from you, is an incredible power. And
absolutely. I think charter schools are actually an example where they are not a monopoly, but they are publicly funded, and they don't seem to have the same perverted incentive structures.
Yeah, and maybe I should mention, I still technically would support a more voluntary model, where I think it would be most functional if the school system was funded through voluntary means. And actually, I support unschooling, which is a subset of homeschooling more than anything. but for some parents that might not be feasible, and sending them to these schools might be the best option they have. And so that might be, important, but I still think it should be voluntarily funded. But this book is more just a study of charter schools versus public schools. And I have heard some arguments since reading this book that there are ways in which charter schools fall short, because they do focus on basic disciplines like math and science and English, and they tend to not be so worried about other things like maybe art or music. And they also tend to focus they're very focused on test results, which can be certainly a distraction to more meaningful pursuits. I can see the value in that, which is why fundamentally I support unschooling. Like, let the kid do what they want.
Yes.
If they're curious, they will achieve great things.
Absolutely.
But,
so on the topic of unschooling, one of the most common complaints against charter schools that I found when I was doing my hit piece research, like essentially by its nature, the model is that you are in some sense experimenting with a small subset of the population, and either they do exceptionally well or they don't, relative. And it's not super important how well they do overall. It's all about how they do relative to like the greater population that's going to be competing for the same like spots in university and stuff like that. And do you think there's perhaps like just an inherent issue with like advantaging some students based on a lottery system or something like that, as opposed to, even if it's not quite as good, like giving everyone a level playing field and letting students like succeed and fail more by their own merits than by which school they get sent to?
I can see the value in just a level playing field, but it has also been shown that children who enter the charter school system, the public charter school system, in these successful academies like KIPP and Success Academy, they on average do far better than the other children who were also applying to charter schools but didn't get in. So I don't think it's necessarily achieving by their own merit. I think there's certain environments that are far more conducive to education and learning. And part of the problem is that public schools refuse to properly discipline just really problematic students, especially recently, because there's been legislation meant to combat racism, actually, because it's been shown that like Black and Hispanic students are disciplined at much higher rates. And this is seen as obviously racism when it might not necessarily be. And so because of that, because it's impossible to discipline well-behaving students more to even the gap, all you can do is discipline everyone less. And so now they have incredible levels of abuse within classrooms where like one teacher, her back of her head was smashed so hard she had nerve damage, and the principal told her to just suck it up and go back to teach, when her student was sent back to her classroom after being in the principal's office for like an hour. And so like we have students physically abusing teachers and remaining in classrooms, and just the level of just dysfunction and interruption, I imagine it'd be very difficult to learn. And so I think that's one of the reasons why charter schools are so much more successful, is because they create safe havens where students who are actually geared towards education can escape these violent environments, which are these institutions that we call public education.
But like if it's a lottery system, some of those same kids must end up in the charter school system. How do they get handled differently there?
Oh yeah, that's one of the arguments against charter schools, is because they're called, there's an argument saying that they're basically being prepared for prison. And it's that the disciplines are very strict, and like if you, like for instance, if you show up at many of these charter schools with the wrong color of socks, you'll be sent home on the first day.
Oh, really? Like school uniforms and stuff.
Yeah, so it's very much like, and the message being sent is rules are important because they create structure in which everyone has a fair shot of creating or pursuing these opportunities. And so if you don't disobey these rules, you're not welcome. And that's simple as that. There's no like physical abuse or anything crazy, but there's very strict enforcement of rules, which has been argued is too strict. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's the case, simply because obviously it's producing good results. And unless I hear some example of some, teacher abusing students in some irresponsible or.
No, absolutely. I don't want to give the impression I'm suggesting that.
For sure, yeah.
Curious about it makes you curious about how it's handled differently, right? And I guess it's just like it sounds like things like suspensions and things like that are handed out more aggressively.
Yeah, there's a no tolerance policy because ultimately, if you don't want to be here, there's a lot of students waiting at the door who would love to go to this public charter school.
Absolutely.
There's a long waiting list, and so charter schools are they're in a position of power in that sense where they don't have to win students over. But yeah, so I think ultimately the best solution, if I were to advocate for the best possible public school or publicly funded form of education in the States, I think it would be where you actually allowed these successful policies to spread out, and you didn't have, that's another thing I didn't mention, is that the government has actually had to step in and mandate that public schools sell their, or put in their contract that they will sell their old buildings to charter schools and things like that. So it's actually been mandated in many states by the government that they must do this because it's been such a history of them not doing that. But
it amazes me that the school even gets to sell its building.
Yeah. Makes no sense to me.
How it would ever work here. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I think it should be something where the successful models spread out more easily and they're given more support. And in many states that is the case, but in certain states like New York and California, especially in recent years, they're encountering a lot of pushback.
Yeah, absolutely. So another kind of broader thing, and this is for all public unions, but I think it applies to schooling just as much. So typically in a private industry model, we don't hold, we hold the upper levels of a company to account when there are failures within the industry. So if you look at Walmart or Amazon or something like that, nobody would say this company is failing because their workers at the lowest levels just suck and aren't achieving at the proper level and they're not firing enough of them and things like that. You never hear a narrative of that form. We would immediately gravitate to the idea that the guy at the helm captaining the ship is the one at fault. If Amazon posts a bad quarter, it's clearly Jeff Bezos's fault. Whereas in the public sector, we tend to take the exact opposite approach. And I find that all of these discussions immediately become focused around, teachers aren't good enough. We have all these old teachers hanging around. We have all these cops that aren't doing their job properly, et cetera, et cetera. And you never seem to hear arguments that are there are bad principals in the system. There are bad superintendents in the system that are causing problems. Or even you see very little criticism ever issued at an education minister or something like that for educational outcomes, which should be their entire purview. It seems like it is intentionally or unintentionally focused on these people at the bottom that are impossible to get rid of rather than the higher levels that would be easy to get rid of. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Is it a convenient scapegoat to say these people who can't be fired are the whole problem?
Yeah, I mean,
something has to be done. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. I've never really thought about that, but I absolutely agree. I think that is a huge problem when we look at these institutions, is because the teachers obviously are following the incentives. They're following the money like almost anyone else, but they end up in these positions because of the structures around them. And fundamentally, the teachers, I think, that end up teaching at public charter schools aren't that different than the teachers that gravitate towards public schools. But I think a big part of it is that they're kind of stuck in these classrooms with these toxic students sometimes, and the students are stuck in these classrooms with these toxic teachers, and there's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
The very fact that it's coercive and involuntary creates a very bad situation. And I think that, it's
sort of set up to fail in a lot of cases, I think.
Yeah.
They're not given the resources they need to succeed, and then people say, why are kids flunking?
Yeah, and it's interesting that we do blame a lot just the teachers and the cops when it is absolutely.
In the police, I find it particularly fascinating that even in a city like New York, where there are thousands of incidents of police brutality, nobody says this is what are the shift leaders and captains doing? It's all like, oh, like these cops need to go to prison. Why aren't more cops getting fired? Like, and the focus is taken off of the people that the government actually could get rid of if they wanted to. Because like, you know, you're not, the chief of police is not in a union. There's nothing protecting his job. Like he could get fired tomorrow if they decided they wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. And this seems like a pretty good segue into police unions as well, unless you had did you have any extra thoughts on public teachers unions or?
I have one more that we could go into,
Yeah.
which is kind of like a stakeholders, like more of a thinking point, I guess, than an argument. But I think often in schooling, the real stakeholders don't actually get a seat at the table. So often the discussion is on the one side, a teachers union speaking for a whole bunch of people, and on the other side, the government or maybe parents speaking for students. And you very rarely hear students actually advocating for themselves and what they want, and you very rarely hear teachers directly advocating for what they want. And do you think that is a contributing factor to the perverse incentive structure? And could we find ways to actually like engage with students and see what they want rather than inscribing upon them like a list of things we think is best for them?
Yeah, well, I think the fundamental way in which we give power and autonomy to students, and ultimately, because oftentimes students are so young, the actual power is going to be given to parents who are trying to make the best decisions on behalf of their students. But just to give them the power to choose what school they want to go to. If they're in a neighborhood where the only school is a corrupt bureaucratic nightmare with terrible teachers and just a principal who doesn't give a rat's ass about anything, then it would be wonderful to be able to escape that situation and take your money, take your tax dollars, take all of your funding, and just leave and go somewhere else. And in some cases, that's possible. And charter schools have allowed some ability to do that. But I think creating more of that ability to, give the choice, allow the money to follow the student where they want to go, I think is a big way to empower parents and, to some extent, students to make the decisions that are best for them.
So you're kind of touching on the idea of like a voucher system.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I was just kind of more as like a thinking point. Like, is there a way? Because often I think part of the issue is that parents don't really advocate for their children in the right way, and that often like what parents want for children isn't necessarily what children want or what's best for them. And is there a way that we could involve, or should we even like humor the idea of like a high school student can probably make educational decisions for themselves versus their parents making them for them and things like that?
I think to some extent that's possible, but generally speaking, I think there's value in parental authority and giving them the right to decide such things. And
I just bring this up because like among students, like most students do not want to be sent to a charter school, whether like it's felt that it's best for them or not. Like being shipped off to a uniformed school, like miles away from where they live, is not on any student's list of priorities.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's just a question there of whether this, as the ultimate stakeholder, whether students should get a seat at the table there or not.
Yeah, personally, I believe that because I'm a big believer in unschooling, which is very based in the consent of the child. If a child doesn't want to go to school, I don't think they should be forced to. I think we should be left to develop our own regulating systems. And if we don't see an immediate value to knowledge like math or even reading, then that shouldn't be forced upon us. There will always be a time in which we eventually see the value because it
like explorative learning.
Yeah, it facilitates some interaction in the world that not having that knowledge would prevent. That was really weirdly phrased. But yeah, at a certain point, it'll be necessary and then we'll acquire the knowledge. And I think that's fundamentally all we need. I just think charter schools could be a good tool, for instance, if parents didn't have the facilities, or maybe oftentimes they're very low income and don't have access to books, or maybe they're just of a culture that they feel like they didn't get a lot of access to education or information, and they don't feel like they would be the best educators, so they want to provide a better.
Absolutely. Like the classic story of like a first generation immigrant who wanted to be a doctor or whatever. Exactly. I agree with all that. Something I've often heard that I like really like the sound of is like teachers as a resource rather than an authority. Like the idea that teachers are there
Yeah,
to help students learn rather than to teach them things.
absolutely. Yeah.
Which I think is like a better way perhaps for our education system to think about it. And also doesn't put teachers in a situation where they're expected to discipline like violent children and things like that. Like we can take them out of that role that's been foisted upon them.
Yeah, like I don't think the idea, I think the idea of no child left behind has a perverse and negative side to it. I
I
think,
strongly agree.
yeah, and I think we don't always acknowledge that. And I think obviously the downside of that kind of situation is that we force every situation or every child into one giant net where,
Yes. And there's almost an idea of like working against the idea of like acknowledging individual learning needs and outcomes and instead going towards a more homogenous, like every kid should get. And there's something to be said for like I said earlier, like there's something to be said for every kid gets the same level of education.
yeah,
And nobody can be said to have advantages or disadvantages. But like fundamentally we live in a society where everyone does different jobs and needs to know different things. And I think if the education system acknowledged that, it would go a long way.
yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. That's all I've got.
Cool. Yeah, and I obviously didn't read a book on public police unions,
Yeah.
but I did do some research. I watched some videos, and there's a few things that I just thought were interesting. And apparently I didn't know this, but the police unions have contracts that are very state dependent or very locally defined. And so it's very difficult to have any kind of general statement about police unions that will cover all of the United States because they're all it depends on the contract essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some things that are generally true. One of the things is the compensation and the retirement package, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Apparently up to 80% of your final year, you receive that till the end of your life. So many police officers, when they're about to retire, it's like a 15 or 20, or I think it's 20 or 25 year career. And on your 25th year, you will work like every shift you can. You'll do as much overtime as you can. And oftentimes they'll make about 150 times their regular rate. And then they get that for life, which is just wild. And yeah, that's just a point that I think I did not realize was true.
Absolutely. That's true of any unionized job, though. Like, if you dig into private sector unions, they get very good deals as well. Although, what should be said there is that they're paying into that out of their wages as well.
Right, which is a big, and I think the argument is that this is kind of bankrupting a lot of it's just, funneling a lot of taxpayer money into the industries beyond what should be.
Absolutely.
And another thing that I realized is that a lot of times when there's an incident, say a police officer shoots a man and there's this huge, media uproar, usually you would have a statement given right away. Like if a cop shoots someone, or if anyone shoots someone, you would arrive at the scene and acquire a statement immediately. But in many places, there's a rule that a police officer cannot give a statement until 24 hours has passed. So they actually have to wait. And this seems to me very suspicious. It seems like obviously this is a situation where they're giving the officer and the surrounding police, the entire police force, an opportunity to everyone get on the same page, get the story straight, figure out what you're going to say, figure out what does the footage say, what can they say to us, what story can we push, and there's this kind of idea of a wall of silence, and where everyone kind of maintains this, where they don't rat on each other. And it's amazing that people have actually interviewed police union members. I think I might have sent you this video, but I might not have as well. But there's a police union representative, so someone who represents. There's a term for it, but
a union rep.
A union rep. Thank you. And he was talking about how, well, of course, there's a wall of silence in this industry. In lots of these places, there's a wall of silence where we protect our own members, and we'll, even if they're guilty of things, we'll defend that. And the interviewer was like, well, isn't that wrong? Isn't that something we should take issue with, and he was like trying to tiptoe around the idea. But
Yeah.
it's incredible the degree to which that's accepted and supported, this idea of defend your brothers in arms, even if they've done wrong. And it seems to be culturally established, at least in the States, based on the interviews I was seeing. And it's fascinating. And obviously that's going to be a huge problem. It's just the culture prevents any sort of accountability.
Can I challenge you on that a little bit and present
Sure.
a counter narrative? Okay, because like as a union apologist, I'd like to give, and I want to stay like, I'm not saying that like cops shouldn't be held accountable or whatever, but in terms of the wall of silence, I think what is often happening from beginning to end. So if you study something like stop and frisk in New York, for example, which was like seen to be like an explicitly racial policy in its execution. For those who don't know, like stop and frisk was a policy in New York under Rudy Giuliani, where essentially like police were just randomly sort of pulling people over and going through their bags and things like that to find drugs or weapons or whatever. And it was found to be like vastly disproportionately targeted towards African Americans and Latinos compared to the white population of New York. And when you have a policy like that, it seems to me that it is not cops being racist. There is some formal or informal mechanism by which cops are being told, maybe in the nicest possible way, like keep minorities off the streets, like keep the streets clear so that rich people can feel safe or whatever, and are given a directive to enforce a racially biased policy. And then that runs for a certain amount of time. Politicians gain the political clout of saying, like, we did this, these outcomes that people wanted have been achieved. And then they will put all of the blame on a handful of cops who are caught in a bad situation. So when you are a cop who gets caught doing this policy, you know that the police department and the city government want to crucify you in front of the populace to say, we're doing our part to stop this, and put all the blame at your feet, again, without holding management to account. And while I will say explicitly, I don't think any cop who does something terrible deserves to get away with it. Often, I think we're pointing the gun in the wrong direction. And rather than saying that this cop should have his life entirely destroyed, we should look at like what put him in the situation where he did something terrible. And I think that's, to give them as much credit as possible, that's what the union is doing. They're saying, we're not going to let you unfairly target certain members of the force who are all following a directive and use them as the scapegoat to justify what was being done by the department at large.
Yeah.
And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really good point. I know we've talked about this before during our police video, how it's a difficult moral quandary to unpack, where if an individual receives orders to do something and they do it and it's awful, to what extent is I'm just following orders a moral, it's a moral excuse to do whatever. And I think it's,
if we have like a directive to like accost people in the street, is the one guy who ends up in a violent situation more culpable than all the other cops who are doing the same stuff and getting away with it?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think obviously if a cop does that and they get away with it and it didn't lead to an intense situation, I think they still did something wrong to a lesser extent because they followed orders to implement a immoral policy. But absolutely, I think we need to put more accountability on the people who put in place these policies, the police chiefs, the police union reps, and all of the individuals who defend the standards that allow individuals to do these things. I think that's a good point for sure.
I don't think I'm going to get any pushback on this, but I'll throw out another one, which is like sort of the whistleblower phenomenon. Like oftentimes in government, there's an idea that by whistleblowing on things that the government is doing, you're sort of betraying like these greater goals, and that maybe a certain amount of secrecy is required in order for your government to like get done what it needs to get done. And do you ever think there's an argument that like maybe whistleblowers, even if they are like exposing truths, are still damaging society at large by their actions?
No, I mean, yeah, I'm very much in. I think there could be a situation in which somebody really needs to do, a horrible, like maybe dirty work requires some pragmatic actions. But I think if that's the case, the individuals involved need to take responsibility for what they did.
Stand by them. Yeah.
Ultimately, and yeah, I absolutely. I think if a whistleblower creates distrust in the government, then that's a government that should be distrusted. And I think if a government wants to be trusted, they need to act in a way that's going to be actually, gain them well-deserved trust, not just claim they're trustworthy while doing all these horrible things. I think whistleblowers close the gap between government promises and reality. And I think that's a necessary function for sure.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Okay.
That is like there is an argument that is often made that the government needs a certain amount of fuzziness in order for the CIA or someone like that to do what they need to do. But yeah, I don't really agree, especially when it comes to issues of police brutality. But you do hear stories. There are a lot of prominent stories of police officers whistleblowing on what's going on, and both the union and the police department just crush them.
Yeah.
Which is horrible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's wild. And I guess one other thing that I was looking at was how a lot of the disciplinary hearings, I guess both in the case of public teacher unions and police unions, oftentimes the unions lobby or the unions push to have them be closed door hearings. So it's an internal investigation where they investigate themselves and they do it behind closed doors. And to me, that's just, I was thinking about that as well. As someone involved with unions, can you think of any reason why that would be a functional, necessary thing?
Well, let me put to you generally. So in theory, although it is practiced less and less, you're supposed to benefit from a presumption of innocence in our society. So there's supposed to be this idea that until it's really proven that you did something wrong, it shouldn't be all over the news that you did something, and you shouldn't be completely chewed up by society until you're actually guilty of something. And I think that would probably be the union argument, that the second it comes to light that a cop was involved in a violent incident, and again, I'm not defending this, but for the sake of argument, the second a cop is involved in an incident, he's going to have hate spewed at him. Increasingly, cops are having violence brought against them in the United States today and things like that. And just the idea that you should have a reprieve from all that until it's actually proven that you did something wrong.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think even Derek Chauvin is a good example where we all decided he was a murderer long before the autopsy report revealed that George Floyd likely died of a fentanyl overdose. And that's a good point. Absolutely.
There's a crisis of confidence that has caused a lot of problems in our society where because we feel in a variety of cases, this is true of police just as it's true of celebrities and billionaires and everything else, it is increasingly felt that the justice system doesn't work in a lot of cases and doesn't find justice. And I think that leads people to say, there's no way this cop is going to prison, so we're going to punish him. The old lynch mob mentality, basically, we're going to make sure justice gets done because the courts are failing us. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say that the courts are failing. In a lot of cases they are. Just today, the Breonna Taylor murder, none of the cops were found guilty of murder, and only the one who didn't shoot her was actually charged because he fired his weapon excessively without accuracy or whatever.
Endangering neighbors, actually. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So every cop that actually shot her was absolved. But so yeah, I think you can see it both ways. Certainly I think cops deserve to have a presumption of innocence, but when the system is failing, mob justice is always the final fallback for any society. And I don't think you get away from that. So
that's an interesting point. And I think, if anything, I would hope that we try to whatever extent possible, fix the system so that we can put our faith back in the system and once again trust it, so that we don't have these mob justice brigades that feel like they need to take it into their own hands. Because absolutely, that that is a danger right now, and I can see the need for protecting people who are innocent until proven guilty. But yeah, I still think that the actual justice process, the hearing, should be open door, but perhaps we should conceal the identity of persons involved until that hearing takes place.
So I'll like, and I hope I don't sound too tinfoil hatty with this, but to what extent do you think the public outcry influences the outcome of a trial in a case like that? Like, do you think, part of me thinks if we didn't have like this huge blow up about the George Floyd murder, like there would have been no charges issued at all. And it's only because probably you get word from the governor or a senator that says something has to happen here, or there's going to be like riots in the streets. Like you can't just let them off completely. Like, do you think that happens? And to what degree do you think that's happening? Like,
and I don't know if it's just me, but you're coming up with some real good points today. That's
this is something that I've thought a lot about. So
yeah, no, I mean, that's a really good point. To some extent, it may be a positive and functional process to have this public outcry, especially right now because there is such a problem with actually achieving justice in this context, in this system.
Like, I'd bring up, to take it away from just being a police, I think that both the Bill Cosby case and the Harvey Weinstein case were similar in that I think, you know, a A-list celebrity against like a bunch of no-name people who no one's ever heard of, like would have destroyed them in court, except for the fact that there's this gigantic public outcry. And like, especially with Bill Cosby, like it just got so much momentum that they're like, it can't be stopped now. Like he has to go. And you slowly saw all of the people who were defending him back down until there was nothing left. And then he gets put in jail for 1 billion years. And same thing with Harvey Weinstein. Like in the early days, everyone supported him, but the public outcry just got to the point where I don't think society would have accepted a full acquittal.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, is that oftentimes there are these institutions of power that are so entrenched and powerful that you need a lot of momentum, a lot of public support, and allowing the public access to information that's relevant to form opinions might be what we need to do that. And I think that happens naturally a lot of times these days because people film everything. Like that Kyle Rittenhouse guy who shot someone in Kenosha, like we filmed that, like everyone filmed that.
Yeah.
And so like everyone was weighing in on what the justice was. And I think that can largely be a positive thing as long as society at large is willing to have an honest conversation and has access to good information and is, you know, equipped with logical analysis. I guess, yeah, I want to believe that that's a good thing to, you know, give. It's like democratizing the whole process of justice.
I think it can probably work both ways too. Like if we were to look at like O.J. Simpson or R. Kelly, I think those are famous cases where like it's largely accepted by society that they were guilty, but because of a huge public outcry in the other direction, they were found innocent by the court of crimes they probably did. So you kind of get, I think it's not necessarily always good, but I think it's always there.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I know nothing about the R. Kelly case, but yeah, I will take your word for it. Something about peeing on underage girls. I think I know the gist of it.
I believe I am speaking, I'm no expert on it either, obviously, but I believe there was video evidence of him urinating on an underage girl and he was acquitted.
Wow. Wow. Just wow.
Or at the very least, like, got a slap on the wrist, like he did no jail time.
Yeah.
That was when he started wearing the bandit mask. That was the start of that thing. That was part of his look because he was like, oh, I'm a criminal. Like, they're trying to lock me up.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's
Another thing that I wanted to share that I found very interesting. So I've done a lot of research on this since I had my run-in with the police this year. So a remarkable number of what they would call like nuisance arrests, like sort of very shaky arrests that often don't stand up in court, happen around 5:30 and 1:30 in the morning, because that's when shift changes at most police stations. And so a police officer will arrest somebody right before their end of their shift so that they can stay and fill out all the paperwork and get
Right.
hours of overtime.
Yeah.
As opposed to just clocking out after a boring day. So that I found interesting.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to say that that's like fact, but I have come across that many times and it makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think as a general rule of thumb, if you allow people to do these things, there are going to be enough people to take advantage of it. Like if there are financial or just power incentives at play, people are going to capitalize them. Maybe not everyone, but there's enough opportunistic individuals in any population that it's going to be exploited.
Absolutely. I guess another talking point I had, because like people often talk about how well paid public employees are, like just across the board, no matter what you're doing. If you work for the government, there's this idea that you get paid really well. But with the case of police and teachers, do you actually think that is really part of the incentive structure? Like, I don't know a lot of police officers that are in it for the money, and same for teaching. Like, you could obviously do with either of those paths. I think you can make more money in the private sector, and I think most of them at least feel like they're doing the right thing and contributing, even if like they're part of the problem. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're overpaid. It's really hard to say in the context of a public employee because they're divorced from market functions.
Yes.
I think if they were hired based on the value that they're perceived to offer society and in a competitive structure, then they would be paid, commensurate with their value. But right now, it's really hard to say. And apparently with public teachers unions, a lot of the ballooning of costs has been around bureaucracy more than anything. So I don't think that because we've seen a huge ballooning in costs around public schools, but it's not necessarily the case that teachers are being paid way more. And yeah, I wouldn't feel, because I've also heard some convincing arguments that cops are oftentimes underpaid and they need better training and we need to put more money into these things. And this could be the case. I don't know. I'm not but I would say, sorry, you look like you're.
I would just say I'm highly skeptical of that. If you look at most city budgets, police is their number one expenditure by a significant margin.
Okay. Yeah.
And like you hear about places like, I can't think of the name. Baltimore is what I'm thinking of, where like their police budget is like insanely huge, and they're still having like rampant issues with crime. I think if you generally study it, you see no correlation between what's being spent on police and crime rates.
Yeah.
Like huge increases generally. Often you see actually like a combative effect, which is that when you arm police officers and give them more equipment and put more on the ground, that gangs do the exact same thing, that they buy more weapons, they recruit more people because they have to keep pace with it. And that like it really has no impact whatsoever.
Classic arms race.
Yeah, exactly. And often by harshening your police presence, you create a larger black market because there are more people that are forced out of the conventional space who might have been, when you have a zero tolerance policy, there's a lot of people that are suddenly pushed into the illegal sphere that need to get their policing from a gang instead of from the public police.
Yeah, for sure.
And
yeah,
be considered.
And just to be explicit, I would support more of a voluntary police option as well, like I discussed in our earlier chapter on police. But yeah, actually our first episode on police. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I don't know much about the funding structures around police, but I definitely agree that there's no correlation between funding and outcome. I think that's been widely accepted, not just with respect to police unions, or police services, but public teachers.
Really,
lots of public institutions. Their success or product seems to have very little to do with cost.
So to go back to schools for a second, kind of talking about the stakeholder thing again, I guess. What do you think are the outcomes that a school system should be measured by to dictate whether it is effective or not? Like when we talk about charter school being more effective, what does that mean to you? Like, what are the metrics? Is it like satisfaction rates? Is it like grades? Is it placement in post-secondary systems? Like, what, in your opinion, are the correct educational outcomes that we should be measuring a school by?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know the metrics that were used in the book were all they used were grades and university placement.
Yeah.
So they didn't use satisfaction or anything else like that. And I think that could be very relevant and important as well. But I do think
something like unschooling, for example, like often going to post-secondary isn't seen as like a primary outcome of unschooling because
no.
there's an idea that like a lot of students will choose not to do that.
Yeah.
So if you judge it by that metric, that won't succeed, right?
Yeah, it's a failure for sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's
Go ahead. Don't be afraid to just like throw some ideas out there.
Yeah, no, it's ultimately, yeah, I think it has to come down to what are the goals of the individual student and parent, and fundamentally, what are the goals of the student, and that's the only metric by which we can judge a policy or the outcome.
Do you think we could capture that in satisfaction? Like if we ask people 10 years later, how was your high school? How would you rate your high school experience? Do you think that that's like a good metric?
It can be good. I think there could be also value in a more objective metric. I know actually there's also a dispute over charter schools around grading. For instance, a lot of public schools take great issue with grades being made public. So they want what they call high stakes tests. Like high stakes tests or anything that would have some sort of impact on the outcome of the school or the student's future.
Yeah.
And so they don't want to make any of that known. They want to have teachers be able to grade their students so that they know which students are doing well and which students need more help, but then the grades would never be shared. And this is also kind of convenient because it allows for horribly failing public institutions to continue to, well, fail their students while there are charter schools who are doing much better down the road and producing much better results. And so I think, yeah, I do think that grades should be made public so that we know when a school is a disaster zone. And I do think that having grades be one of the metrics by which we measure the success of an institution is useful. But yeah, I do think we should look beyond that. And I don't think that grades are the fundamental measure of success, or like IQ is a fundamental measure of success. It's just one very useful metric.
IQ is deeply flawed to begin with, even if it were a theoretically good metric. How do you feel about like standardized testing? Like in Alberta, for example, like schools all have to take like the same like provincial achievement tests, and that's often used as a marker of like how successfully they're teaching the curriculum. Although standardized tests are increasingly criticized as unfairly disadvantaging certain students. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely, I think standardized testing is necessary for the sorting process. And I think, yeah, the argument has been made that it's unfair to minority students, but I think this ignores the outcome of institutions like the Success Academy, who do produce, like there's an assumption that certain types of problems or certain disciplines are more difficult for minority students or like Black or Latino students. And I don't think this is true at all. I think that it just depends on, how you're taught.
Certain things, like one that I've read about that's been pretty extensively studied is the idea that like the way double negatives function in English is very confusing and difficult for a lot of people from other languages.
Okay. Yeah.
But sometimes, like the classic example in Canada in particular is that we have like the yeah, no, and the no, yeah, which like one of those means yes and one of those means no. But like for anyone who doesn't speak English, that's really difficult to be like,
Right.
Yeah, no means no, and no, yeah means yes. And like oftentimes in testing, like you can all remember the test that's like, which one of these is not a criticism of whatever? And questions like that, like just the wording of a question can significantly impact outcomes for people for whom English is their second language.
I can see that.
Which
Although,
is like just something that is studied and is being remedied, but there are certain things that have been fairly well criticized. There are other things that are more subjective that I would disagree with, but
okay, I can see the value in what you're saying. I do think maybe in certain circumstances, it could be useful to literally test people's ability to comprehend English in all of
Absolutely.
its awful nuances. And in that case, obviously, we have to have, it will contain some bias against people for whom English
Absolutely.
is their
And
second
like
language.
to an extent, like if you can't functionally speak the languages of the society you're in, then like that's a natural disadvantage that we don't need to necessarily fully compensate away. But
I do think that there is value in leveling the playing field. And if, for instance, we're trying to test someone's ability to solve a math problem, their ability to distinguish between a double negative and not is irrelevant. And we don't want to punish someone in that context for just their problems with English if they're just trying to pass math.
And a big problem with this is just like the nature of standardized testing is that often like a 4-choice multiple choice question needs to have like double negatives and things like that. Like you need to have like, not none of the above as an answer just to make it work.
Right.
And that can be just built into sort of the nature of the testing itself.
Stupid English.
Yeah, I know, right?
Just
I'm a
toss the whole
computer
thing
science guy. English almost killed me when I was in high school.
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah. Do you have any other thoughts you wanted to dig into?
I covered the main points, everything that I can remember that I wanted to talk about. And I still am not sure if I have sorted out in my mind what is the defining characteristic of a public union that makes it so dysfunctional. I think I still believe it's the fact that it's a coercive monopoly, but I feel like there's still something else going on there that I'm trying to unpack and make sense of, but I'm not sure.
Something that is difficult with the public union, like the combination of the two factors means that often with the public union, you have something that every teacher has to be in the public union, and then every teacher's paying dues towards a union, which is then lobbying the government that pays those employees. And you kind of create like a short circuit in the feedback loop where it's no longer going all the way back to society and filtering up. You're sort of getting a very quick loop of teachers get paid more, the union gets paid more, they can lobby more. I think that can be problematic. I do think that teachers have, I don't agree with ever restricting someone's right to unionize, which is where that becomes difficult. Like, I don't think because you work in a certain industry, you don't get to advocate for higher wages and things like that. But I could perhaps be convinced that political lobbying is not necessarily a fruitful part of that exercise.
Yeah, and it is very difficult when you have, and this is something we never touched on, but when you have a government monopoly and they have the power to strike, it's a very dangerous power. And this is something that was opposed for a long time and they eventually won the right to. For myself, it's a simple answer because I don't support government monopolies. And so the problem doesn't arise. But for yourself, do you have any particular thoughts on that? I know you just seem to share them just now, but maybe you could elaborate.
Well, I will share like a story to the contrary, which like in our province of Alberta, under the new Democratic government, which is obviously very pro-union, the head of the government was a union rep and all that. But the government, they were willing to work with the government in a time of economic crisis, and every single union took a pay freeze in order to stop like rampant government spending and help the government balance the budget. And that's sort of an example where everybody works together for the common good. So that also does take place from time to time, although they may have been much less cooperative with a government that was more combative towards them.
Right.
But I guess I would say it's important for people, it's important that employees of a union take an active role in it. When unions become very dangerous is when they become disconnected from the boots on the ground. And they're pursuing the union's priorities rather than the employees' priorities, which does happen and is unfortunate. So the best thing you can do is be involved, and you often have a lot of rights to have your opinion heard in a union, much more so than your government that people never take advantage of. So get out there and do that.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like I have expressed the main gist of what I wanted to say. Do you feel you're ready to move on to final words, or?
Yeah, I think I can move on to final words. I don't think this will be the last time we talk about unions, but
No.
I think we've both left each other with some good thinking points.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, do you have your, I guess it would be your turn on
My
this.
closing, yeah, I start and then you finish, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I guess my closing words about public unions is that ultimately a union's job, unions are paid by employees to represent employees. And we would never fault an employer for hiring a lawyer to represent them when they were in the wrong. We would never fault a criminal for hiring an attorney to make sure that they weren't treated unfairly. And a union is in some sense the same thing. Employees, when an employee is never going to win against the government unless they have a union to back them up. And that's the sad reality of the times we live in. Those are my closing arguments.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I would just say, to reiterate, I think that there's a temptation to believe that public unions are for the good of the public. And oftentimes they are pursuing individual gain like anyone else. And I think it's important to dig deeper when we look at these relationships between government and unions and the people they represent. We need to look a little closer and see if they're actually serving the public. And yeah, if they're at odds with institutions that are actually doing an incredible good, like solving the issue of institutional racism or the education gap in school. If that problem has been solved, yeah, and that's not being celebrated, that's an incredible indictment on the intentions of public teachers unions. And I think so. I'm very happy that this book was written, and I would love to see it more, widely disseminated.
Do you want to tout the book one last time?
Plug it one more time? Yeah, I do. The book is called Charter Schools and Their Enemies by Thomas Sowell, who has reached a ripe age of 91.
Yeah.
It's very exciting.
He's still alive, right?
Yeah. I will be so sad when he dies.
No.
Yeah. He might actually be 90. I don't know. 90 or 91. I forget. He's old. He's old.
Yeah.
Wait, was he 80? Maybe he was 80. I don't know. Fuck. Oh, God. Spreading all this wrong information on the internet.
Hey, that's okay. That's what the internet's for.
Oh. Well, on that note, hey, thank you for joining us on this episode of Public Unions with Luke and Tyson.
Yeah. Coyotenomics.
Yeah. See you next week. Adios.